Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of discussing Schaeffer's How Should We Then Live? I think that might be the first time that I got it right. Yeah, I got it right. I just checked. In this episode, we are going over the Revolutionary Age, which is probably the title on the list of his 10 that I was least familiar with in terms of what were we going towards before the episode started? It made a lot of sense as soon as he got going. But yeah, I think this is one that probably takes a minute to really kind of familiarize yourself with historically. And as the series goes on, we're getting closer and closer to the present day. But I would say prior to the scientific age, which is our next episode, this one still feels historical. The scientific age starts to get really personal, and we're like talking modern. We're like talking stuff that it feels like I have lived as a young person. The Revolutionary Age is probably his last episode where I still feel like I've read it in a history book and not lived it myself. And so, anyway, just an interesting experience here. He talks about some really neat concepts that I really had not connected to the Christian worldview. So, Dan, I feel like that's a great intro for you to lead us into your overview and some notes.
Yeah. So we're on the Revolutionary Age, look at my notes because I've been writing so many different thoughts. Just a couple quick thoughts, and I want to hear from all you guys. There's a lot to talk about here, but a couple thoughts that I had that would be helpful. First of all, I would tell people to go back to once they're posted, episode like 3 and 4, only because I do a little PowerPoint presentation there, and we talk about this idea of a unified field of knowledge. So I'm kind of, reviewing here a little bit. But the big thing in history for 2,000 years was this looking for this answer of a unified whole that brought, if you will, the non-physical, the metaphysical, non-physical world together in an area of knowledge with the physical world that made sense. And I can't go through all that right now. I did the last couple episodes, so I would encourage you to go back there because you got to get that in your mind, because that is the ongoing conflict that's always there. And this one really brings that out. So one of the things he talks about through this episode is form and freedom. Form and freedom. There's this human desire for freedom, while at the same time, there needs to be form. Form meaning some kind of structure, law, what's the word I'm trying to think of? A meaning, purpose that gives the freedom a place to run. And we talked a lot about that the last 2 sessions. But in this time, instead of universal, particular, metaphysical, physical, it's form freedom. You see that? It's the same dichotomy, though. And his claim throughout this is the Christian worldview gives you both. And by having meaning, purpose, law, form, the freedom has a place to live and demonstrate without taking off by itself. Again, the word we've used is autonomous. If you let freedom go by itself, when you see throughout here, this is what they end up by doing, it turns into a really bad place. And I would say, biblically again, it's just Genesis 3 again. It's just man's going to go do his own thing and think he can come up with the answers to life on his own. And when he does, wanting this freedom, he ends up by not having freedom. It actually ends up by enslaving him. So if that makes sense, that's a construct throughout here. And then of course he unfolds that in history here. Okay. And then the only other thing I would bring up, and we'll see where this all goes, but what he's trying to show is that within society, you could even say the American society today, U.S. society, there is floating around, if you will, a Christian worldview or a history of a Christian worldview. Again, we've talked about that. The point being is there are people who individually are not Christians, or in some cases maybe they kind of float around in a Christian world, go to church or something, but they're not really Christians. They haven't really trusted Christ. But even those folks live their life adopting these truths that actually come from the Christian worldview And what he talks about here in this revolutionary age and the development of society and government is in many cases they use the biblical principles, even if they weren't actually Christian, if that makes sense. And so that's the point in all this. He's not saying that every one of these people he mentions obviously are Christians. His whole point is that they're borrowing capital from the Christian worldview. And when they did, it really facilitated some wonderful blessing and goodness. So there's more to be said. I'll leave it at that. And so, and Sam, Gabe, John, you guys jump in where you want to, and I'll just leave it at that for now.
Well, that works both ways, Dan. You mentioned, your last point there.
Yeah.
The borrowing capital. Well, that works in a framework where the secular world is still pursuing a good, right? But it also works on the other side where the borrowed capital allows maybe the antithesis of the biblical worldview to function for a while, because underneath of it, it's still got some good, right? And they're not truly taking their ideology to where it would go or where they should start from. It's sort of a hybrid. And until you run out of that capital, you're not going to see the end result. Now, that's a lot of stuff that Schaeffer is talking about in the revolutionary period. Is some of those things went to the end. They ran out of the capital, right? Yep. And then so you actually began to see the fruit of what was actually in that ideology versus kind of the middle ground as it's developing to that point.
Yep. Very good. And we've talked about this, just to add in there. Am I still on here, by the way, guys? It seems like I've kind of disappeared or something, and I'm not sure why.
No, you're still on.
Okay, good. Okay, sorry. I'm sorry. Okay. What was I going to say? Sometimes this gets framed in some modern discussion or current contemporary discussions, and you guys are familiar with some of these, like with the Trojan horse, with sovereign nations, talking to two atheistic philosophers who actually embrace, and they're talking about Western civilization and the goodness and the wonder of Western civilization providing this open public square for education. But my contention would be, and this is what Schaeffer would say, is that they're borrowing capital. They're borrowing from the worldview, not picking on them because I agree with them on a lot of their assessments of what's going on. It would be a different discussion to go, well, where did you come from to get those things that you so appreciate? Education, rights, all these sorts of things. And it comes from a Christian worldview. So some, again, in our world, would frame it as the beauty and wonder of Western civilization as a good. But I'd say, yes, that comes from something, meaning the Christian worldview. Right? Is that what you're saying, Gabe? Yeah.
It's called cut flower ethics is another thing I've heard. The flowers are beautiful growing in nice fertile soil. All of Tina's flowers, right? But as soon as you cut those and you put them in a vase, well, they've only got so long to live because they've lost their nutrients.
That's a great way to say it. I like that.
Yeah.
What was it Frank called, Gabe? I want to write it down.
Cut flower ethics.
Okay. I never heard that before. Yeah. That's good. Good.
I guess what I found, there's a lot that I found very interesting in this video that Schaeffer did. But I like how he said that the biggest apology, or you could say apologetic for the Christian, is to act more consistently with their biblical base. And I mean, again, I immediately just want to run right to application, right to our present day. But, the example he gave, though, was the slave trade back then. Now you have these Christian societies, England, the New World, America, and they're built on this Christian worldview, this Christian base. But then the question is, well, then why was there this African slave trade, which was just blatantly anti-biblical? What's the reason for the inconsistency? And as I was studying church history a semester ago in seminary, it was interesting that, this revolutionary age, all these revolutions are happening: the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution kind of came around at a perfect timing too. Here you have an increase in industry, productivity, capitalism is starting to flourish in a sense. And so then you start to get this kind of greedy materialism happening, and you start to justify, in a sense, a way to produce more and make more money. So here you have these Christian societies in one sense are flourishing under this, with this strong base, but then at the same time you're having all this increase in industry and you're starting to get greedy and you want more and you want more and you want more. And how are we going to produce more, with not incurring the greatest cost? Well, slavery is a pretty good solution to that, free labor. So you start to see this connection with the flourishment that a Christian presupposition gives you, but also then, hey, man's still fallen and man still has a depraved heart and he still thinking about himself in certain instances, and that's where you start to see the inconsistencies with the African slave trade come in. But I thought that was interesting, and he mentioned Wilberforce and John Wesley, guys that were promoting the more consistent expression of the Christian worldview and the Christian base in their country. And it's amazing that a guy like Wilberforce could be in Parliament and be in the English government to kind of start to try to correct the ship a bit. Yeah.
And so quickly, just for those watching, again, I hope you can watch all the episodes and follow through, because there's a little bit of a tracking here that's important. When Schaeffer talked about that, of course, that he was talking about how the humanist base, which I hope we talk more about here, had such an influence on the world around us. They wanted freedom and all these things apart from God speaking, apart from the biblical truth, the biblical absolutes that God gave. And the problem with it then, right? And is that what you're trying to say, Sam? There was an inconsistency in the church. The church adopted. When I say the church adopted, you got to be careful. When I say church, I don't even mean institutionally per se in the sense of like a doctrine, but the people began to entertain these ideas. They weren't thinking about them. They brought them into their lives. They bring them into this community of believers. And so Schaeffer is trying to note at least the two areas he saw as great inconsistencies. One was in the African slave trade, and secondly was this wrong use of wealth.
Yeah.
That's the point. He was just saying in that as, here's where I see some of the inconsistencies during that time period.
Right.
But it came from the humanistic base. That's the point.
Right,
and
exactly.
It was adopted. Right.
And that's what's so important to realize, is that it is an inconsistency. It is not taking the Christian worldview to its logical conclusion. Right. Whereas that's where you could kind of say he created this compare and contrast between, the American Revolution and then the French Revolution, and this idea that, well, if you take materialism or humanism, these non-Christian presuppositions and basis to their logical conclusion, it actually would result in something like a slave trade. It would result in what we see in Nazi Germany and, communist Russia and China. So that's consistent. Whereas when you have a Christian society like England was and the New World was in America, the slave trade would be inconsistent with it, and Christians would actually have to act outside of their worldview in order to justify it.
Right. And he's trying to be honest in saying Christians did act wrongly outside of it.
Right.
So anybody that wants to take a shot at it, we would agree. We would say, oh, yeah, that Christians have been inconsistent.
Right.
But they're inconsistent with what God has actually said.
Right. And that's what you can weigh it against the scriptures. And that's what he said. The Bible is the basis for morals and laws. It's like, okay. Yeah. And then he even gave the example of even the one can come with the Bible and go against the majority and say, hey, no, you're wrong. Why?
Right.
Because we have the book, the Bible, that's our basis for morals and law. And you're able to do that in a society that's built on Christianity or on the Bible. Somebody can say, hey, look, what you're doing or our laws or whatever we're doing is inconsistent with the book, with what God has revealed, the absolutes. So, whereas,
the hypocritical, the hypocritical nature of a Christian within that system or an institution or a church or whatever only shows the need for the law-based, the justice-based system of government that Northern Europe put in place too, right? Because their innate assumption was men are evil. And so we have to have checks and balances, and we need to have the ability to say the king is wrong, that 51% doesn't rule everything, right?
Mhm.
They have that piece in there because they know humans are fallen.
Right.
And
that,
you know, what the way the church acted through slavery, or what, you know, when he talks about the ineffective use of wealth, or just the desire for more. Well, that's just an indication that the initial system was the best way to go. You know, you can't improve the system. You can just improve the consistency within it.
See, that's just so awesome that you guys are bringing this up, because this goes back, if you remember in the beginning, one of the first quotes that I gave, and I quoted Schaeffer, where he talked about how people think they will live, they will act out.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what we keep trying to emphasize, why even way back in the introduction when I did this with John, and it's coming to the surface right now, and I'm kind of excited, that's why I'm speaking, is guys, the stuff that Schaeffer was talking about that you guys see with each of your generations, you know, there's Sam in his 20s, John in his 20s, Gabe 40 now.
45.
40 what?
40.
Oh, good night. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm almost, you know, and I'm 15 years older than Gabe. We all see the same stuff. And the point is this, is that if we go back and say the foundation, where do you begin the discussion? I'm going to do what Schaeffer keeps saying. You have to start with the God who's actually there, the personal, infinite, triune God actually exists. Not the idea of God, not theism, God himself. And then God actually spoke. But God actually communicated. He actually gave us real knowledge. And Sam and I had a big talk on a podcast earlier about that, by the way. For a plug for Sam, go to his Preach and Persuade podcast. So we talked about this. But the point in all of this then is that the next presupposition then that's really helpful and we need to understand. So God's there, he spoke, he created man. And how did he create man? And then we get into the dignity of man, and we get into the fall of man. Now see, we're sitting here, because I know you guys, and that's kind of in our guts. We kind of understand this because we've been so educated by it, understand it, seen it, live it. It's in our DNA almost, the way we live life. We look at human beings, we have this great awe of human rights because people were created in the image of God, but we fully understand, first of all, because God revealed it to us, our own terrible fallenness, our own cruelty within our own souls, but we see it around us. It's called sinfulness. Well, that's the point. These people actually had a worldview that comprised those elements I'm talking about. And what they did is, it wasn't just their personal act on a given day, am I moral or immoral? They literally built entire political governmental systems based on thinking. Mm-hmm. And so he contrasts, here's two revolutions. They both wanted revolution. They both wanted freedom. You had Britain and you had the French Revolution. And I know there's a lot more details to history here. You know, we're talking about some statements. But in a general overview, there's a radical difference between these two revolutions, and it had to do with worldview. Yep. The one wanted freedom based on humanistic ideas. The other one wanted freedom taking into account the reality of the world we live in based on the Reformation, biblical reality from God. Mm-hmm. Not, again, because they were all Christians, but they saw two fundamental deals. And like you, Sam, you're always excited to get the application, and I am too, but I'll just say, this is the conflicts you're seeing in our culture right now. Right. In the news and politics. I'm not saying Republican versus Democrat, please get that out of your mouth. That's not what I'm saying. But there actually are fundamental worldview clashes going on. And those worldviews give you a lens by which you're looking at what's going on. And you see this. I mean, you see it. You see it in households, in churches, in families, in supremely society, and the news every day. Different news report, different things. It's not just political party. It's actually worldview differences. It's really fascinating.
Well, I think what's fascinating is how similar the French Revolution, or the way people thought in the French Revolution, is to how people think today, even in our own country. And again, and this ties in with postmodern thought too. Here you have the French Revolution was promoted as this, this bourgeoisie thing, the working class, the peasants, they were sick of getting oppressed by the nobility, the monarchy. And indeed there was some injustices happening. The French monarch, the French king he definitely was favoring the nobility. He was, giving them tax exemptions, things like that. So there was real problems happening. but they revolted, obviously, and it was promoted as we're just sick of this oppression, and you would expect them to be more, you could say, capitalistic. Let's have a free market type thing. But what you see is none of the peasants or none of the working class that revolted were capitalistic at all. They were very socialistic. And so if you study the French Revolution, you really see that, hey, they were more motivated by a hatred for the nobility than an actual, desire for a free market or desire for freedom in any way. They were motivated by hatred. And then Schaeffer did this. He said, the French Revolution is much more like what we see in Marxism and communism and what was happening in Russia. And then you can study communism and Marxism, and you see, it's really not about a love for the poor or a love for the working class. It's kind of motivated by a hatred for the rich and a hatred for the employer type, or a hatred for the capitalists. And that's what Jordan Peterson likes to pull out too. And so then what we see today is kind of very similar. We have this postmodern thought promotes this idea that it's, they're motivated by a love for the oppressed group, a love for the minority group. When in our reality, if you follow the train of history, if it's anything like the French Revolution or anything like communism, then it's actually motivated by a hatred for the oppressor group, which in today's society has been labeled the white, Christian, heterosexual male. So I think it's just fascinating.
Yeah,
there is a connecting line though.
Well, and it's also an indication that human nature never changes.
Exactly.
The humanist ideology that man is perfectible and we're on this straight line path to just perfection, or utopia. Well, that's not true, right? We keep circling back to these same issues that happened hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and it's just going to happen again.
Right.
Which, Schaeffer, this may be a little bit of a tangent, but you can read his stuff or watch his stuff, and you can kind of see he kind of follows a similar path where he describes things in like a vector, right? We're on a continual line,
yep.
Speed of direction. And you can almost look at these two and go, okay, well, with each new age, the old age is gone. But that's not really the case. It's this repeating thing. It may be the age where science got its real start, or revolutions got their maybe more significant start. I mean, I don't know. Heck, you could probably even say Israel revolted and left Egypt, right? That was a revolution. So the things continue to happen. Just because we're out of that age doesn't mean we're no longer in the scientific or the revolutionary age.
Right.
So there's a little bit of, you can read it and have a kind of a depressed outlook, or just think, crap, man, this is never going to get better. We're just continuing to go downhill. Or you can look at it and go, well, okay, these things continue to happen over and over and over, and take some peace in that too, right? It's nothing new. Nothing new under the sun. There's a season for everything.
So early on, Gabe, somewhere in one of our discussions, I framed it. Maybe that was the introduction. I don't remember. We're on 5 and 6 now, so I don't remember. But I talked about reshuffling the deck.
Yeah.
Like all the cards are always the same. And that's what's fascinating, right?
Yeah.
And so somewhere, even in our, a little bit of time this morning, we'll get to there in a few minutes, but that's what I would want to say. Okay. So what Schaeffer's been doing in 30 minutes, covering hundreds of years, it's kind of crazy, but the themes are always the same. That's the point. That's exactly your point, Gabe. And we've been emphasizing the themes are always the same. So since they are, and once you kind of see them and you see how the Christian worldview is informed, but either informs that or it is here, it gets back to that question of the whole film series: how then shall we live, right? And so I'm not officially calling this a segue unless we could move there. So, given our life and our days that we're living in, how do we see now, these same cards now playing themselves out in our day? Gabe, as you're ministering to college kids, Sam does it from sort of what I don't know what you call Sam, a millennial to a millennial, or millennial to Generation Z now or something?
Gen Z now, yeah.
Yep.
But Gabe, you have a lot of these college students in your home weekly, and you have these conversations. What do you guys see? What are the pieces out of here that are playing themselves out before you guys' eyes?
Do you mind if I pose a question real quick?
Oh yeah, go John.
I want Dan's question to be left out there, but maybe mine kind of goes in conjunction with it. So pretending that I'm an atheist or just a non-theist, non-participating, is Schaeffer positing that a Christian theocracy would lead to the greatest human experience, and like conditionally, like everything would be at its peak if there was a Christian theocracy? If the United States would embrace its full heritage as a Christian nation and would today openly acknowledge the Bible as the center for the classroom, the center for the political landscape. Is that what Schaeffer is positing? Is that what the four of us are making the claim?
You ask me. Go ahead, guys. Yeah, go ahead.
Flip it around. If you don't believe the Bible could be the king or the ruler in all of those areas, why do you believe the Bible?
Right.
I mean, I think that's a difficult question in our current age, because if you talk about the Bible being the center of the classroom, well, all of a sudden people think Genesis is a science book or whatever, right? And that becomes a discussion versus it's like what they talked about in the next episode, which we'll get to, but the Bible is what undergirds the scientific exploration, right? It's not that the Bible is a science book, that idea. Then absolutely it could be a theocracy. It gives you the footings that you need to establish the other systems off of it, right? So it's interesting. I had a conversation with a pastor one time who this still baffles me, but he said, a socialist could be a Christian. And I said, okay, yeah, a socialist could be a Christian, but socialism cannot be done by Christians, right? It's a difference. You can be within a socialist society and be a Christian, but it doesn't work the other way around. Mm-hmm. So I think the only way you can be a Bible believing Christian is to say, yeah, this is what the foundation is in every area of my life. And that includes every area of my life. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah. Well, I agree with you, Gabe. Like you're hitting something, and then I would expand. And as a Christian with a Christian worldview, if I started again with my presuppositions, I would come to a place, however, though, and maybe this is what John is throwing the question out to bait us to get us to rise to this occasion, is that I fully understand that not everybody's going to accept the Christian worldview. And I live in a world where God has chosen me out of this world to live in a separate realm, if you want to say it that way, as a Christian. And so I have a dual citizenship, right? My greatest citizenship is with God in the heavenlies. And as a Christian, I'm supposed to live within a context of what God's called me to live. And though I know I'm going to live in a world that's not going to accept that. So the point is while I agree with you in theory, if I could say that if you could take this, and I think that's going to be the new heaven and the new earth, is we will live under this rule. We will live under the beauty of this form and this freedom, and it will be the ultimate of the ultimate theocracy, right? It's going to happen.
Right.
But here and now, though, while I don't live in that, I, as the church, meaning the people of God, am supposed to demonstrate it and live it to the best of our ability within the context of who we are as a people, given the fact that I have a dual citizenship, which makes that difficult question that Christians have always had: how do I be in this world but not of it?
Right.
So expanding on that, I don't think that we can demand, even as Christians, I can't demand a theocracy today in my land. I know some people might go there. I mean, it'd be great because I think it would bless people, but I don't think it's going to happen. So I certainly am supposed to be that in the church. And I know Gabe, you and I are good friends, so I know I mean, we're on the same page of this. So in principle, yes, I would say we want Jesus as the ruler of every area of my life, every area I think, the way I raise my family, the way I raise my community, the way my community of believers within the church should respond to the world. I think for us, that's so I'm very much like, we're supposed to be a separate people. At the same time, because of my worldview, says, I know the world around me is not going to agree with that. And so I'm supposed to keep peace with them to the extent that I can. I'm supposed to be a peacemaker, keep putting it out there. And with that, though, John, I think this is where Schaeffer goes, and I read some critiques of Schaeffer, and I'm talking too much here, but there is a place for us to respond to the world around us and hold out. Now, how we do that, that's the difficult discussion. How do you do that? But we are to hold out to the society. We are to be, the prophet of a society. We as a people, if you want to say it that way, we are to say, no, you guys are wrong. I mean, we should be pro-life. I mean, we really should, when it comes to the abortion issue, the church clearly should be going, that's wrong.
Yep.
Church should clearly have a godly, biblical sexual ethic.
Right.
When the church caves to this horrid sexual ethic that's being shoved down our throats, we should be going, no, that's wrong. Now, how we handle that, we should be kind and gracious, and I'm fully embracing of that. But I'm talking about ideologies now, the isms. We should be going, no, that ism is wrong. So there's individuals who are dealing with, say, sexual issues or whatever it be. We should be loving, kind, helpful, but we should say, no, that's wrong. And the ism, the ideology is just it's not of God. It's not of our worldview. We should not be embracing those things. And we will be accountable for that as a people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to go back to your theocracy comment too, in principle, absolutely. But then there's a whole Genesis 3 issue, right? So no matter how much we want to do it in principle, we're not going to do it correctly.
Yeah.
There's going to cause all sorts of downward problems, right? Or downstream problems.
Yeah.
So I want to poke the bear again. It feels like
that's you, Dan.
It feels like Christian, at least hear me trying to play devil's advocate. It feels like Schaeffer wants the credit for checks and balances and universal moral absolutes being a positive effect on the law. He wants all of that credit of the bloodless revolution to fall into the hands of the Christian, while looking at the poor use of wealth and the slave trade, particularly of the Americas, lasting so much longer than many other places, and say, well, those people weren't real Christians. The real Christians were responsible for all the positive things, but the non-real Christians, or the bad ones, were responsible for the bad stuff. Is he being dismissive of the responsibility there?
I could answer it, but I want you guys to. Sam, you've already addressed that just a few minutes ago when we talked about this.
I mean, even the regenerated Christian is going to sin. I mean, that is the truth. So we can't just look at the Christian, let's just say individual, and say, oh man, he sinned, therefore let's just throw up this whole Christian worldview. It's wrong. No, that's not the case at all. And Christianity is built on Christ. And if we look at Christ, he was perfect. You will find no moral error in the life of Christ at all. And now the cool thing about Christianity is that through the work of the Holy Spirit and the scriptures, we are being conformed to that image progressively. So there should be, in the true Christian, as John was saying, there should be a pattern of being conformed to the image of Christ. But just because you see Christians in error or Christians living inconsistently with their worldview or with their scriptures doesn't mean that you can therefore then just throw out this worldview. Like, it's not, that's you could say a logical fallacy in a sense. What was I going to say though? Where was I going with that?
Well, keep going with inconsistency though. I mean, I think that's what Schaeffer's addressing, right?
Well, right. I mean,
it's not black and white, John. I know why. I think why you're asking the question. It's a great question. I don't think that's quite what he's doing. He's saying where the Christians were consistent with the teachings of Christ, with the scriptures, there was human flourishing. There was these good things, the blessings. When they were consistent, when they are inconsistent, whether it's the sin of a culture or an individual, the church's sin, we see these fallouts. But the fallouts So he wasn't giving all credit. It wasn't all or nothing, black and white, quite like that. It was talking about the consistency to the Christian worldview. Did that make sense what I just said?
That makes a lot of sense to me. I
Okay.
think it, and okay, so I'm throwing another spoke in the wheel.
Which hold on real fast, John, which I think is probably the best way to answer that question today, because the idea of slavery is so there's so many different definitions or ideas people have in their head when they hear that it's really hard to argue every one of those finite details and levels, types, and everything else, right? So just to stay in that inconsistency level seems to be the wisest place to stay. Keep it at that level.
I think the answer to this next question is going to revert to the same answer, actually. But if Schaeffer is posing that the answer to the Enlightenment problem and the humanistic central view, the singular as opposed to the transcendental question, if starting at that problem leads to the French Revolution of beheadings of 40,000, or not beheadings specifically, but the killing of 40,000 people or whatever. So that's the problem of the Enlightenment. So the answer to that is that you have a universal moral absolute that you answer to, and you have, at the very start of the Schaeffer episode, you have the judge pointing down at the Bible with the sword. So the answer then could be sufficiently also provided by Islam and the Quran. They also have universal moral absolutes. They have the same framework and context. So why not impose a Islamic theocracy as opposed to a Christian one in order for human achievement?
Right. Well,
right. And,
go ahead, Sam. I
was just going to say, and this is where you get into this. You hear it a lot today. You hear, people like to say, well, there's the radical Islamics, and they want to compare those as though they're comparing apples to apples, as though that's the same as the radical Christian groups like the Ku Klux Klan, or these white supremacist Christian groups, or even the Crusades. They'll use them as an example. And it's not apples to apples. You can't say, you can't make the comparison, because here's the deal. If you study the Quran, and you study Shira Allah, I think it's called, you see that the radical Muslims are actually living consistently with their worldview and consistently with their base of authority, the Quran, their scriptures. They're living consistently. They're drawing a consistent conclusion. And you could say the ones that are more peaceful are actually living inconsistently with their book. Whereas when you look at the Christian worldview, you see that, again, consistency. The Christians that promoted the Crusades, the Christians that are the Ku Klux Klan people, they're not really Christians, but they say they are. In order for them to do that, they're living inconsistently with their authority. So it's not the same comparison in the Islamic world and the Christian world at all. And I think that's something that people miss. They just think that both radicals of each group are living inconsistently, and that's not the case at all.
Right. That's good. That's a great comparison. And the other big one, John, that actually Schaeffer brings up later, and we're all sitting here as this discussion, I know the worldview of all of us here. So though this didn't specifically say it here, you have to remember that what we're talking about, let's go back to presuppositions. We're talking about a personal infinite God that can be known. Yeah. And then what God gives us in the scriptures, what Jesus came, preeminently Jesus, and gave us in the scriptures as a prophet to the scriptures. He said, the scriptures, you read the scriptures, you know me. To know me is to know scriptures. He tied himself to the scriptures, okay? To hear Jesus. So some people say, well, those are the red words. I want to hear what Jesus has to say. And I'm like, read any word in your Bible and you're hearing what Jesus says. It is the word of God. So there's two key things. And again, Schaeffer will bring this up, I think, in an episode or two from now. Two key things we have. We have that we're separated from God because of our sin, and Jesus came as the Savior for us. And so we can have a personal relationship with God through Christ. But it doesn't stop there. He also gives us form. That is, he gives us ways of living life, law, form, in which to live out this freedom of relationship. And so if I go to another religion like Islam, that borrowed much of what it developed, Muhammad borrowed it from the world around him, both the pagan world and the Christian world. He borrowed a piece, but a piece doesn't get it. You know, it's this whole thing. God gave us both in his word, a relationship with him and a construct for how we are to live life. And so it's not just, here's the rules, live by these rules. It's actually, here's the plumb line of rules. You really can't because of your sinfulness. So trust me and I will work these things out in your midst.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's just another thought. So,
you know, going back to what before John gave us these devil advocate stuff, kind of tying into what you said about application, Dan. You know, I think about today, like consistency with the Christian worldview. You know, everybody today would be you could say the majority would be appalled and are appalled at the African slave trade. And we identify that as something sinful and wrong. But now you've just moved the box, though, in today's world. You move the box to now, like you said, the sexual ethics stuff. Now you have inconsistencies with sexuality, homosexuality, transgenderism, premarital sex, all this stuff that, you know, let's say during the 18th century and 19th century would have been considered by everybody to be wrong. Now that's considered to be okay, but what was considered to be wrong or right, you know, slavery in the 18th and 19th century today is now considered wrong. So the box of what's wrong or what's sinful is just shifted to something else. So with application today, we as Christians need to realize that we have to live consistently in every aspect of our life, and that includes sexuality as well. And I mean, it gets super hairy today because, I mean, people are so hypersensitive to anything sexual. If you want to talk about sexuality today, I mean, if you say anything against the general narrative of you know, the postmodernists, it's hate speech, it's bigotry, it's everything. You're transphobic, you're homophobic, you're a horrible person. And I think Christians tend to buy into that, and they shut their mouths, or they just kind of go their own way, and they don't act or speak consistently with what their Bibles actually say.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
Something I find interesting is that Schaeffer at the end, and I think this pertains to application. So,
yeah.
His problem that he talks about is that Christians of the day, the church, was failing to speak out against its own hypocrisy. It seems that Schaeffer was less concerned with the church speaking out against cultural hypocrisy or the sins of the world, you know, the secular world going astray. It seems like he was less concerned with the church speaking out against that, and more concerned that the church's greater failing was that it didn't speak out against its own internal hypocrisy. So what would be the hypocrisy that we're speaking out against today?
Yeah. Now you just stepped in some really muddy water, John.
A lot.
Because here's the frustration. This is such a frustration for me. Okay, so let me just give you an application point as a way of example. Communism. Okay, now when Schaeffer's speaking, this film series is late 70s. Okay, and you'll see in an episode or full coming up, he very much predicts where at that time he's talking about modern man. In fact, that would be a tip I would tell you. As you're watching the series, he keeps talking about modern man, but he's right on the fence. I don't mean he's on the fence. I mean, like historically, he's straddling something. And what he's straddling is a tip into what we now call postmodernism. And he does allude to that. He talks about relativism, where this modernism leads. It leads to the place you can't have any truth, cruelty, and non-cruelty are the same thing. He's talking about relativism. And I'm tipping my hand to you because that's in an episode or two from now. Now, with that said, he's living in the highlight, if you will, of a communistic world, meaning Russia, the former Soviet Union, China. We came out of Cambodia. We saw communism go into places in Africa. And here's my point. In a certain sense, on textbook, communism sounds good. Oh, we're all going to share the goods. We're all going to be fair to each other. It's going to be a utopia. Okay? This is why this flourishes today in academia, because it's an idea. It's an idea. And the idea is, hey, everybody should be fair. Behind communism really is socialism, okay? We're just all going to share. We're all going to be fair and make it equitable for everybody. Okay, well, that can sound good in an idea. But once again, let's go back to a reality of our presuppositions. That's not the world we live in. The world we live in is a world that has the depravity of mankind. We have sinfulness in our world. So whenever this idea of communism, socialism, Leninism, Marxism, all very similar, has come to the table, well, on textbook it can look fine. What ends up by happening is a very small percentage of people control everybody else. It turns into a tyranny. It's never worked, and it can't work. And so in a real way, communism is a Christian heresy.
Yeah.
Because we do believe in an equitable world, but guess what? It's not this world. It's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. It's going to be a world that we do all share, and all of our full diversity and dignity expresses itself. And in this world, you're not going to see it. That's part of our debate, is that because of the sinfulness, it can't work. So here's the frustration of the muddy water to answer, talking about your questions and what we're talking about here. Sometimes the church says we need to correct something. You're right now, you'll hear a younger generation say that you guys have done this thing wrong. And they'll want to change, if you will, a biblical Christianity. But their idea to change comes from something other than Christianity, and it's not right. So there are inconsistencies we need to, and one of the inconsistencies would be this very issue. We need to adopt our worldview and understand we live in a fallen world, right, and understand that this again, I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but it seems to be predominant in a younger generation of socialism. If you're a Christian and you're leaving listening to this, I would urge you to go back and think through your Christianity, your presuppositions. God's there. He spoke. What's it mean to be human? The fallenness of man. And realize that socialism is an idea that floats around in our universities and academia, and it's permeating our culture. And wherever it has happened has brought nothing but death and destruction. It's contrary to the Christian worldview. And that gets brought into the church and then leveled at the church as not being equitable enough, oppressive. And it's like a reversal. It's like I don't know, you guys help me. You know what I'm trying to say. It's like, well, that's not what we need to correct. The inconsistency we need to correct is adopting wrong ideas.
Right.
Does that make sense? Did I say that?
Yeah. Yeah, you said it great.
Okay, you guys run. I didn't know. I know what I'm after, so go run with that, please.
Well, there's a question I've asked a lot, and I know a couple of guys in college ministry that use it as well. Is are people innately good or bad? Good or
That's
evil?
good.
And if you just trace that down, it shows you that what they think is where they act. Right? Socialism only works if people are innately good. Mm-hmm. Because we're not, it doesn't work out that way, right?
Oh, good.
So you can do socialism in your family, right? Make your kids pay rent or anything like that. But you can't do that outside of your family. And a lot of people think, well, we can just make the world around us our family, right? Government is our parents. We can just be family together. Or they'll look at Acts 2 or something, right? And say, well, look how they live. Well, sure, that small group of people who manage that function themselves, right? Who all have the same, kind of sign the same contract or whatever. Sure, you can live that way. But it doesn't work in a much wider space where there's all sorts of different perspectives of people and sins and everything else. Mm-hmm. I've been thinking recently, I know we're about out of time, but you asked about some of the hypocrisy of the modern day church maybe. So this COVID thing has been very interesting to me because the way churches are acting with this physical threat is a big dichotomy against how they act with the non-physical threats. Think of the culture, the society around us, social media, all those different ideas that are constantly coming through our mediums, right? Especially into our kids. But we don't act the same way against those threats that we do against this virus.
Example. I know where you're going. Give me an example, Gabe. What do you mean?
Well, I mean, we're running scared from the COVID virus, right? I mean, everything we're doing is you could get killed anywhere you go, which there's some truth to that, maybe, right? If you have the right lineup of factors, absolutely. However, when it comes to pick your app, right? Pick your medium that people have on their phones. Pick the TV shows, the movies they watch, the music they listen to, the people they follow as influencers, the books they read, whatever. Well, the church stays silent on all that stuff, right? And we don't want to step on people's toes. We don't know what parents are thinking, so we're not going to have any aspect where we're going to talk about those things as wrong. We're not going to put up any barriers to those. Heck, we're just going to use Snapchat, Instagram. We'll pick your poison when it comes to apps to communicate to our youth groups with. We're going to invite kids into all those spaces, and it's just like, guys, what's the most serious threat here? In our entire county, we're down to 62 people that have had COVID, and I think 60 of them have recovered now, right? But how many people are being infected by this stuff day in and day out, and we're okay with it?
Yeah, and
because we can't see it.
Yeah, and I don't want to just be the guys sitting at McDonald's or over the coffee arguing, being a curmudgeon. Okay, but
you're missing out on that, though, aren't you?
Yeah, I am. I like my McDonald's, but here's the problem. The minute you talk like that, Gabe, there are people who say, "Oh, I don't want to be a fundamentalist."
Right.
The label. It's like, well, no, it's not about a label. It's about being a Christian in this world, out of this world, and pursuing holiness. And perhaps there's things that we're participating in. We haven't even taken the time just to sit and at least consider it, at least think about it before you just absorb it.
And
right?
At least wear a mask, wash your hands, be how close you get to people. All that. It's the same stuff. Just put it into the world, right?
Right.
Man, that kind of feels like a good wrap point, unless somebody's got final thoughts.
Wrap it up, because I could talk for hours on this.
Okay. Yeah, I think we all could. But kind of my big takeaways, I think, sort of come from my questions, but also from all of your sharing that the Christian worldview is unique in that Jesus is unique. The Christian will be even a truly renewed person in the Christian faith has the capacity to participate in something as horrific as the slave trade, and yet the Christian is unique because we are not making the claim that we as persons are the answer to the problem, but actually that we're just participants in the one who is the answer to the problem, and that is Jesus. And no other worldview holds that sufficiency, because no other worldview has perfection himself wrapped up in the transcendent metaphysical, outside of our world, as well as flesh tied to that. And we've talked about that in past episodes, but we just keep coming back because he is the way, the truth, and the life. And when I think we talked about kind of the hypocrisy of the church today. I think one way that I've identified from Gabe's, Sam's, and Dan's answers has been the hypocrisy of the church today that we are really in need of speaking out against is actually the same as going on in the slave trade. And that is that we live biblically inconsistent lives. And that when something is going wrong, whether it be socialism, leaning into socialism today, or a really kind of a capitalistic slavery back in the day, the poor use of wealth for the sake of progressing the economy. In both situations, what you're seeing is Christians and the world, but particularly inside the church is our critique, who are subscribing to worldviews and philosophies that are not the way of Jesus. And so that's my wrap up. But I think that's what I've kind of gathered from the conversation. And yeah, I think we can acknowledge our responsibility in the matter and repent. And in Jesus, there's perfect freedom and grace and forgiveness to say, I've lived inconsistently, and I would like to turn around and walk the other way and live your way. And so that's my wrap up for this episode. And you'll be able to join us for episode 6 in just a moment. We'll have Gabe back and Sam and Dan. So that's the end of this episode.